The Bay of Naples, the year 59 of our era, the quiet deceptive surface of the water reflected myriads of stars and the pale crescent of the moon. The air, imbued with the thick aromas of myrtle, pine, and the salty sea, was still. Here in Baiae, the most luxurious resort of the Roman Empire, far from the noisy, bustling, and politically tense Rome, tranquility reigned. This was the place where the Roman elite built their most grandiose villas, seeking refuge from the summer heat and the political intrigues of the capital. But it was the calm before a storm, a stillness that concealed a monstrous tension beneath. No one suspected that the emperor himself, the young 22-year-old Nero, master of the world from Britain to Egypt, had given an order unthinkable and monstrous in its essence, an order that violated all laws of gods and men, an order to kill his own mother. But she did not know it yet, or perhaps she suspected but pushed the terrible thought away. She was sailing on a luxurious Liburnian, specially built for her, returning from a feast hosted by her son. The feast had been the height of pretense, a carefully orchestrated performance of filial love that had long since vanished. He had embraced her at parting, kissed her eyes, demonstrating remorse and a newfound tenderness. And she, a woman whose life experience should have taught her to trust no one perhaps for a moment, believed that she could still win back his love, his obedience, her boundless power that was slipping from her hands with each passing day. And so, to the rhythmic splash of oars, under the high starry sky, the vessel suddenly began to fall apart. The plan was diabolically simple and at the same time theatrical, as her son loved it. A shipwreck, an accident, a tragic coincidence that would rid him of her tiresome supervision. But she survived. At 43 years of age, this woman, pampered by decades of luxury, raised in the comfort of imperial palaces, found within herself the strength and will of her ancestors. In the confusion and darkness wounded, she threw herself into the water and swam to shore. Julia Agrippina, known as the Younger, great-granddaughter of the divine Augustus, sister of the mad Emperor Caligula, wife of the deified Emperor Claudius, and mother of the reigning Emperor Nero, she survived only to die a few hours later. Having reached her villa on the Lucrine Lake, she, assessing the situation with icy composure, sent a messenger to her son with the news that by the grace of the gods and his good fortune she had escaped a terrible danger. She was still playing her game, trying to seize the initiative, to show that she knew everything. But the game was over. Soon assassins sent to finish the job burst into her chambers, overpowering the guards. Seeing a centurion with a sword raised above her, she, baring her abdomen, uttered with a proud and icy calm a phrase that became her epitaph, and an eternal curse upon her son, telling him to strike the womb that had borne a monster. How did a woman born at the very pinnacle of power manage to rise even higher, becoming the most powerful figure in Rome, effectively a co-ruler? How did she, having survived exile, conspiracies, and mortal enmity, manage to place her son on the throne, bypassing the legitimate heir? And how did this very son, her greatest creation, her sole purpose in life, become her executioner? To answer these questions, we must go back to the very beginning, to the days when the Roman Empire was just getting used to its new masters, and in the veins of one little girl flowed the blood of gods and the greatest heroes of Rome. This is not just the story of a woman. It is the story of power in its purest, most ruthless and tragic manifestation. This is the story of Agrippina. To grasp the essence of Agrippina the Younger, her indomitable, almost superhuman ambitions, and her unshakable belief in her own destiny, it is first necessary to understand who she was by birth. She was not merely an aristocrat. She was the living embodiment of the Roman Empire itself, a dynastic project, a fusion of the two greatest families that had created and ruled that empire, the Julii and the Claudii. The blood that flowed in her veins was revered by the Romans as almost divine. Let us start with the Julii, an ancient patrician clan that traced its genealogy to the goddess Venus herself through her son Aeneas, the legendary Trojan hero who fled a burning Troy and became, according to myth, the forefather of the Roman people. For centuries, the Julii were prominent, but not the most influential figures in the political life of the Roman Republic. Everything changed with one man, Gaius Julius Caesar, a brilliant military commander whose conquests in Gaul expanded the Roman world to the Atlantic, a brilliant orator, a subtle psychologist, and a ruthless politician. He realized that the old republican system created to govern a single city was rotten and incapable of ruling a vast Mediterranean empire. He destroyed it in a bloody civil war and paved the way for monarchy. Although he fell to the daggers of senatorial conspirators, his name and legacy became a banner for his grandnephew and adopted son Gaius Octavian. Octavian, a frail-looking youth with an iron will and a genius for politics, completed his adoptive father's work. In a series of new, even bloodier civil wars, he methodically eliminated all his rivals, Caesar's assassins, Brutus and Cassius, and then his last opponent, his former ally Mark Antony. Under the name Augustus, he became the first Roman emperor. He ruled for over 40 years, from 27 before the Common Era to 14 of our era, and this period went down in history as the Pax Romana. He brought long-awaited stability, prosperity, and order to a world tormented by a century of wars. Augustus was Agrippina's maternal grandfather through his only daughter, Julia, his blood, the blood of the founder of the empire who was revered as a god after his death, flowed in her veins. This was a legacy of divine status, brilliant politics, and absolute power. From the Julii, Agrippina inherited not only a belief in her divine origin, but also a sharp sense of her own dignity, a political instinct, and a fundamental understanding that power is not given but taken by force, cunning, or intrigue. But the second branch of her lineage, the Claudii, was no less important. This was another ancient and proud patrician clan, known for its stubbornness, conservatism, loyalty to tradition, and at times unbridled pride. The Claudii gave Rome many consuls and commanders. The key figure who connected this family with the new dynasty was Livia Drusilla. An outstanding beauty and intellect, she came from the Claudian clan and became the wife of Augustus. Livia was the first empress of Rome and perhaps the most influential woman in its history. For decades, she was Augustus's closest advisor, his shadow, his gray eminence. Malicious tongues in Rome, always ready to believe the worst, claimed that it was she who, through a series of mysterious deaths and poisonings, cleared the path to the throne for her son from her first marriage, Tiberius Claudius Nero. Tiberius, adopted by Augustus, became the second emperor of Rome. He was Agrippina's paternal grandfather. From the Claudii and from her great-grandmother Livia, she inherited harshness, determination, the ability to bide her time, and a readiness to do anything to achieve her goals, not shying away from any methods. Thus, Agrippina was a unique product of Augustus's dynastic engineering, which sought to merge the two noblest families of Rome. She was a Julia on her mother's side and a Claudia on her father's. In her, two great rivers of Roman history converged. But even that was not enough. Her immediate parents were not just aristocrats, they were idols, living legends of their time. Her father, Germanicus, was the son of Drusus the Elder, Augustus's beloved stepson and the brother of Emperor Tiberius, and Antonia the Younger, the daughter of Mark Antony and Octavia, Augustus's sister. He was the nephew and adopted son of Emperor Tiberius, who adopted him on Augustus's orders. Germanicus was everything that the gloomy, unsociable, and suspicious Tiberius was not. He was handsome, charming, accessible to the common people and soldiers, and a brilliant military commander. His campaigns in wild, forested Germany, where he tried to avenge the terrible defeat of Varus's 3 legions in the Teutoburg forest, brought him immense fame and the love of the army. The soldiers adored him because he shared all their hardships and personally knew many of them by name. The people in Rome saw him as the ideal prince, the true heir to the spirit of Augustus. His popularity was so great that it aroused the poorly concealed jealousy and suspicion of Emperor Tiberius. Agrippina's mother was Vipsania Agrippina, known to history as Agrippina the Elder. She was the daughter of Marcus Vipsanius Agrippa, a brilliant commander and administrator, Augustus's closest associate and son-in-law, and Julia the Elder, Augustus's only biological daughter. Agrippina the Elder was a woman worthy of her husband. Proud, indomitable, she was the embodiment of old republican virtues, fidelity, honor, fertility. She accompanied Germanicus on all his campaigns, lived with him in the military camp, and shared all the hardships and dangers. She bore him 9 children, of whom 6 survived, a rarity even for the imperial family. She was not afraid to speak before mutinous legions, and her words sometimes carried more weight than the orders of legates. She was called the mother of the camps. And so, in this family, in the midst of glory and popularity, on November 6th of the year 15 of our era, in a town then called Oppidum Ubiorum, on the border of the empire on the banks of the Rhine, a girl was born. She was named Julia Agrippina. The place of her birth was deeply symbolic. She was born not in the pampered palaces of Rome, but in a military camp, among soldiers who worshipped her father. Later, upon reaching the pinnacle of power, she would ensure that this town received the status of a Roman colony and was named in her honor. Colonia Claudia Ara Agrippinensium. Today we know it as Cologne. She became the only woman in history after whom a major European city was named. Her birth was an event of imperial scale. She was the daughter of the heir to the throne, the great-granddaughter of Augustus. Her childhood was spent in an atmosphere of adoration and fame. But clouds were already gathering over her family. The fame and love of the people were a dangerous commodity in the eyes of the aging and increasingly suspicious Emperor Tiberius. The first years of little Agrippina's life were haloed by her father's glory. After his German campaigns in the year 17 of our era, Germanicus returned to Rome, where he was given a grand triumph. Crowds of people rejoiced in the streets, showering the hero's chariot with flowers. On the chariot, next to the triumphant father, rode his 5 children, including the 2-year-old Agrippina. This was the apex of glory. But for Tiberius, this popular love was like salt in a wound. He decided to remove his popular nephew from Rome. In the year 18, Germanicus was sent to the east with special powers, supreme authority over all governors and legions. His task was to bring order to the provinces and to settle relations with the powerful Parthian Empire. With him, as always, went his faithful wife Agrippina the Elder and their younger children, including the future Empress. This journey was a triumphal procession. In Greece, Germanicus was greeted as a god. He entered Egypt, violating Augustus's strict prohibition for senators to visit this strategically important province without the emperor's permission. But the Egyptians greeted him with enthusiasm. However, in the east, success was not all that awaited him. Tiberius had prudently appointed Gnaeus Calpurnius Piso, a proud, stubborn man from the ancient republican nobility, as governor of Syria, and his wife Plancina, a close friend of the all-powerful Empress mother Livia. Piso did not hide his hostility to Germanicus and constantly clashed with him, openly challenging his orders and trying to undermine his authority. Behind Piso clearly stood the emperor himself. And so in the autumn of the year 19 in Antioch, after returning from Egypt, Germanicus suddenly fell ill. The illness was strange and agonizing. Germanicus himself and his entourage were convinced that he had been poisoned. He openly accused Piso and Plancina of this. In his chambers, as the historian Tacitus writes, sinister objects were found. Hidden in the walls and under the floor were human remains, spells, and lead tablets with Germanicus's name, which indicated witchcraft and black magic. On October 10th of the year 19, at the age of 33, the darling of all, the hope of Rome, passed away. His last words, addressed to his wife, were a call not for revenge but for steadfastness and care for their children. Agrippina the Younger was only 4 years old at this moment. The death of Germanicus plunged the empire into shock and mourning. Agrippina the Elder, grief-stricken but not broken, personally accompanied the urn with her husband's ashes to Rome. This funeral procession turned into a most powerful demonstration of popular love and sorrow. People came out onto the road, lit altars, wept, and cursed Tiberius and Piso. When the ship with the ashes entered the mouth of the Tiber, it was met by countless crowds. Tiberius and Livia themselves did not leave the palace to meet the procession, which was seen as further proof of their guilt. In Rome, a trial of Piso was held. There was little direct evidence of poisoning, but there were enough charges of insubordination and fomenting civil war. Piso, seeing that Tiberius was not going to protect him and fearing a conviction, committed suicide. His wife Plancina was saved only through Livia's intercession. For many, the guilt of the imperial family was obvious. For little Agrippina and her siblings, their father's death was the end of their golden childhood. They became orphans, the children of a fallen hero, and more dangerously, living symbols of opposition to the ruling regime. Their mother, Agrippina the Elder, neither forgave nor forgot. Proud and unrestrained in her speech, she made it her life's main goal to fight for the inheritance of her sons, especially the eldest, Nero Caesar, whom she saw as the rightful heir to the throne. She saw Tiberius as her husband's murderer and a usurper, and his all-powerful praetorian prefect, Lucius Aelius Sejanus, as the root of all evil. Agrippina the Younger grew up in this atmosphere of mourning, suspicion, and deadly political struggle. She watched her mother turn into a hounded but unyielding fury. She lived in the palace on the Palatine, but it was not a home. It was a snake pit. She saw how Sejanus, a man of low equestrian origin but of immeasurable ambition, gradually concentrated immense power in his hands. He united the scattered cohorts of the Praetorian Guard into a single camp at the walls of Rome, becoming the commander of the only army in the capital, and enjoyed the boundless trust of Tiberius, who in the year 26 retired to the island of Capri, leaving Sejanus to effectively rule the empire. Sejanus saw Germanicus's family as his main enemies and methodically destroyed them. One by one, he eliminated their supporters, accusing them of conspiracy and treason. Then he targeted the children themselves. In the year 28, at the age of 13, Agrippina the Younger was married to her great-uncle, Gnaeus Domitius Ahenobarbus. This marriage was arranged by Tiberius. Ahenobarbus came from an ancient plebeian family known for its wealth, but also for its cruel, unbridled temper. It was said of his father that he was so cruel that Augustus had publicly censured him. Gnaeus himself, according to the historian Suetonius, was a detestable man in every respect. By marrying Augustus's great-granddaughter to such a man, Tiberius perhaps wanted to humiliate her and her family, but at the same time, this marriage saved Agrippina's life. She moved from her mother's house to her husband's, formally stepping out of the line of fire that Sejanus was preparing for her family. And the blow followed. In the year 29, accused of conspiracy, Agrippina the Elder and her eldest son Nero Caesar were arrested. Their mother was exiled to the island of Pandateria, the very island where her own mother Julia had once languished in exile. Her son Nero was exiled to the island of Pontia. A few years later, they would both perish. Nero, driven to despair, would commit suicide, and Agrippina the Elder would die of starvation, refusing to take food. Her second son, Drusus Caesar, was also arrested and starved to death in the dungeons of the Palatine Palace. Agrippina the Younger, living with her odious husband, was a powerless witness to the destruction of her mother and brothers. She survived, but the lessons she learned in these terrible years, she remembered for the rest of her life. She understood that in the world of imperial power you could trust no one, that proximity to the throne was not a privilege but a mortal danger, that fame and popularity could lead to ruin, and that the only guarantee of survival was ruthlessness, cunning, patience, and the ability to hide one's true thoughts. She learned to wear a mask. In the shadow of the imperial eagle which had turned into a vulture, the character of the future empress was forged. In the year 31, an event occurred that shook Rome to its foundations. The all-powerful Sejanus, who had almost become co-ruler and was about to marry into the imperial family, was suddenly overthrown and executed. Tiberius, having received proof of his conspiracy from his sister-in-law Antonia, Germanicus's mother, struck from Capri suddenly, swiftly, and mercilessly. The fall of Sejanus triggered a wave of terror and score-settling in Rome. But for the surviving members of Germanicus's family, it was a deliverance. Agrippina the Younger and her two sisters, Drusilla and Julia Livilla, as well as their only surviving brother Gaius, known to history by the nickname Caligula, which comes from the Latin word caliga, meaning a soldier's boot, which he wore as a child in his father's camps, were now once again the center of attention. Tiberius, having lost all his direct heirs, his son and grandsons, was forced to bet on Germanicus's children. He summoned Caligula to him on Capri. In the year 37, after a long, gloomy reign, the old emperor finally died. Rumors immediately spread through Rome that he had been smothered with a pillow by the praetorian prefect Macro, with Caligula's knowledge to hasten the accession of the new master. For the 25-year-old Caligula and his sisters, a golden era began. All of Rome, exhausted by the terror and suspicion of Tiberius, ecstatically welcomed the young emperor, the son of the adored Germanicus. The beginning of his reign was promising. He declared an amnesty for political prisoners, repealed the treason laws, and hosted lavish games and cash distributions for the people, and he showered his sisters with unprecedented honors. Agrippina, Drusilla, and Livilla became the central figures of the new court. Their names were included in all official oaths alongside the emperor's, where people swore to spare neither themselves nor their children for the well-being of the emperor and his sisters. Their images appeared on coins, an unprecedented event for living women who were not the wives of a reigning emperor. They received the rights and privileges of Vestal virgins, including the best seats in the theater, and the right to watch the games with the emperor. The Senate and the people saw this as the restoration of justice, the triumph of Germanicus's persecuted family. Agrippina, who was 22 at the time, felt the taste of real power and glory for the first time in her life. And in that same year, 37, she bore her husband Gnaeus Domitius Ahenobarbus, her only child, a son whom they named Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus, the very boy whom the world would later know by the name of Nero. It is said that when friends congratulated Gnaeus on the birth of his son, he grimly replied that from him and Agrippina, nothing could be born but a monster and a universal calamity. These words proved prophetic. However, the idyll did not last long. The brilliant beginning of Caligula's reign soon gave way to madness. After a severe illness which may have damaged his sanity, the emperor began to show all the signs of a cruel tyranny and megalomania. He demanded divine honors for himself, declaring himself a living god, engaged in endless conflicts with the Senate, executed people on the slightest suspicion, and squandered the treasury on insane projects like building a bridge of boats across the Bay of Naples. And at the center of this madness were his relationships with his sisters. Ancient historians, primarily Suetonius, unanimously accuse Caligula of incest with all three sisters. He particularly favored Drusilla, whom, according to rumors, he loved not as a sister, but as a wife, and even intended to declare his heiress. How true these accusations are is difficult to say today. They could have been part of the propaganda aimed at blackening Caligula's memory after his death. However, there is no smoke without fire. The public and excessive displays of affection, the joint feasts where the sisters reclined next to the emperor in the presence of their husbands, all this shocked conservative Roman society and gave rise to the most sordid rumors. Agrippina and Livilla, as Suetonius asserts, also did not refuse their brother's advances and, moreover, offered their services to his influential friends to strengthen their position at court. They lived in a world where moral norms were blurred and access to the emperor's body meant access to power. In the year 38, Caligula's favorite sister Drusilla died suddenly. Her death plunged the emperor into inconsolable grief. He deified her, erected temples and altars to her, and forced all of Rome to mourn. But after her death, his attitude towards his two remaining sisters changed dramatically. He became suspicious and cruel, and here Agrippina made her first, almost fatal, political mistake. In the year 39, seeing the growing discontent of the Senate and the army with Caligula's madness, she and her sister Livilla became embroiled in a conspiracy. The conspiracy was led by Marcus Aemilius Lepidus, the widower of the late Drusilla and, according to rumors, the lover of both sisters, and Gnaeus Cornelius Lentulus Gaiatulicus, a popular military commander who commanded the legions in Germania Superior. The plan was probably to kill Caligula during his trip to Germany and place Lepidus on the throne. Agrippina and Livilla obviously expected to become the new emperor's wives and to rule alongside him. But the conspiracy was discovered. Caligula acted with lightning speed. He went to Germany, where he executed Lepidus and Gaetulicus. He subjected his sisters to public humiliation. He forced them, as punishment, to carry the urns with the ashes of the executed conspirators across the Alps, from Germany to Rome. He read their love letters in the Senate, accusing them not only of conspiracy but also of adultery and debauchery. Their husbands, including Agrippina's husband, Gnaeus Domitius, were left alive, but the sisters themselves were stripped of all their property and exiled to the Pontian Islands in the Tyrrhenian Sea, the very islands where their mother and brothers had languished in exile and perished. For Agrippina, this was a catastrophe. Overnight, she went from being almost a goddess to a state criminal. Her young son Lucius, who was only 2, was separated from his mother and given to his paternal aunt, Domitia Lepida, to raise. His inheritance was confiscated. It seemed that Agrippina's fate was sealed. She had exactly repeated her mother's path. Exile on the Pontian Islands was tantamount to a death sentence. But fate was preparing another most incredible turn. While Agrippina was surviving in the harsh conditions of exile, a new conspiracy was brewing in Rome, this time a successful one. On January 24th of the year 41, Emperor Gaius Caligula, the monster, was assassinated in a corridor of his palace by officers of the Praetorian Guard led by Cassius Chaerea. The assassination of Caligula plunged Rome into chaos. The Senate, for the first time in many decades feeling the spirit of the old republic, gathered on the Capitoline Hill and began to heatedly discuss the restoration of the former order. Some senators even put forward their own candidacies for the role of princeps. But real power, as always, was in the hands of those who had weapons, the Praetorian Guard. While the senators were making speeches, the Praetorians, who had killed one emperor, were busy looking for a new one. They were rummaging through the deserted palace, looting and settling scores. And in one of the rooms, hiding behind a curtain, trembling with fear, they found a man whom no one had ever considered a candidate for the throne. It was Tiberius Claudius Drusus, the uncle of the murdered Caligula and the own brother of the great Germanicus. Claudius was perhaps the strangest and most underestimated figure in the entire Julio-Claudian dynasty. From childhood, he had suffered from certain physical ailments. He limped, stammered, his head shook, and his nose constantly ran. His own mother, Antonia, called him a monster that nature had only begun but not finished. His family was ashamed of him, considered him mentally deficient, and kept him away from state affairs. But behind this unprepossessing exterior lay a sharp and educated mind. Deprived of the opportunity for a political and military career, Claudius dedicated himself to scholarship. He was a serious historian, the author of works on the history of the Etruscans and Carthage, an expert on antiquities. He had survived the bloody reigns of Tiberius and Caligula precisely because no one took him seriously. He played the role of a harmless eccentric, and now the soldiers, finding this terrified 50-year-old scholar, dragged him out from behind the curtain and, to his complete astonishment, proclaimed him emperor. They carried him on a litter to their camp. The Senate, having no real power, had no choice but to approve their choice. One of the first decrees of the new Emperor Claudius, who, despite his reputation, turned out to be a surprisingly capable and sensible ruler, was the recall from exile of his surviving nieces Agrippina and Julia Livilla. For Agrippina, this was a resurrection from the dead. She returned to Rome, but her position was precarious. Her husband, Gnaeus Domitius, had died of dropsy during her exile. Her son Lucius was growing up in someone else's house. She had no money, no influence. She was a pardoned criminal, completely dependent on the mercy of her uncle emperor. And she began to act with her characteristic energy and calculation. She needed to restore her fortune and her position in society. And the surest way for a woman of her rank to do this in Rome was through an advantageous marriage. Her choice fell on Gaius Sallustius Crispus Passienus. He was one of the richest and most influential men in Rome. He was intelligent, educated, had twice been consul, and was the adopted son of the famous historian Sallust, and most importantly, he was fabulously wealthy. There was, however, one nuance. Crispus was married, and to Domitia Lepida the Elder, Agrippina's aunt and the mother of Valeria Messalina, the young and already all-powerful wife of the Emperor Claudius himself. But this did not stop Agrippina. Using her charm, her royal blood, and perhaps hints of her closeness to the emperor, she persuaded Crispus to divorce Domitia and marry her. This marriage, concluded around the year 41 or 42, was a brilliant strategic move. It immediately returned Agrippina to high society and gave her what she needed most: financial independence and a huge fortune. She also got her son Lucius back. Claudius's new wife, Valeria Messalina, was almost 20 years younger than Agrippina. She was beautiful, sensual, and completely immoral. Having married the old Claudius even before his accession to the throne and having borne him 2 children, a daughter, Claudia Octavia, and a son and heir, Britannicus, Messalina felt herself the absolute mistress of Rome. Together with her allies, the emperor's powerful freedmen like Narcissus, Pallas, and Callistus, who ran the chanceries and effectively ruled the state, she decided fates. She sold offices and Roman citizenship, staged show trials, confiscated the property of rich senators, and, as all ancient authors claim, indulged in the most unbridled debauchery. Her sexual appetites became legendary. Tacitus and Suetonius describe how at night, under an assumed name, she would work in a lupanar, that is, a brothel, competing with professional prostitutes. The most famous story is that she held a contest with the most famous Roman courtesan and defeated her by serving more clients in one night. For Agrippina, the years of Messalina's reign were a quiet but tense time. She was forced to stay in the shadows. Any woman from the imperial family who could be seen as a potential rival was a mortal threat to Messalina, and Messalina eliminated them one by one. Thus, another of Claudius's nieces, Julia Livilla, Agrippina's own sister, was executed, accused of adultery with the philosopher Seneca, who was also sent into exile. Agrippina understood that her life, too, hung by a thread. She behaved as modestly as possible, stayed out of politics, devoted herself to her son's upbringing and the management of her vast fortune, which grew even larger after the suspiciously timely death of her husband, Crispus Passienus, in the year 47. Rumors immediately spread through Rome that Agrippina had poisoned him to inherit all his property. There was no proof, but the reputation of a poisoner began to follow her. She knew that Messalina hated her and her son Lucius, for Lucius, like Britannicus, was a descendant of the imperial family. He was the son of the great Germanicus's daughter, and in the eyes of many had no fewer rights to the throne. Messalina saw him as a threat to her own son and, according to rumors, even sent assassins to the boy who were supposed to strangle him in his sleep. But as the legend goes, the assassins retreated in horror upon seeing a snake that crawled out from under the child's pillow and protected him. Most likely it was just a snakeskin that the boy kept as an amulet. But the story became widely known and was taken as a sign of divine protection over Germanicus's descendant. Agrippina waited. She waited for her impulsive rival, who was losing her sense of reality, to make a fatal mistake herself. And in the year 48, Messalina made it. Having lost all sense of proportion, she fell madly in love with Gaius Silius, who was considered the most handsome Roman aristocrat. She forced him to divorce his wife and began to live with him openly, assuring him with gifts and honors. The apogee of this madness was their public wedding. While Claudius was in the port of Ostia, inspecting grain supplies, Messalina in Rome, in the presence of witnesses and having made all the proper sacrifices, officially married Silius. What was it? A drunken prank, a fit of madness, or a cold-blooded coup attempt to overthrow Claudius and rule with Silius in the name of the young Britannicus? Historians still debate this. But for the all-powerful freedman Narcissus, the emperor's secretary, this was the last straw. He realized that power was slipping from his hands to Silius, and he decided to act. He rushed to Claudius in Ostia and, in the darkest colors, told him everything. The terrified emperor, convinced that he was facing an overthrow, gave the order for the arrest and execution of Messalina and all her lovers. Messalina was stabbed to death by a Praetorian tribune in the gardens of Lucullus, which she herself had taken from their previous owner. The position of Empress was vacant. For Agrippina, who had been patiently waiting in the shadows for almost 8 years, a window of opportunity opened, and she was ready to burst through it. The fall and execution of Messalina created a power vacuum at the imperial court. The 58-year-old Claudius, shocked by the betrayal of his young wife, reportedly swore in the Senate never to marry again, since marriages brought him nothing but misfortune. But his freedmen, the real rulers of the empire, understood that the emperor needed a wife. She was necessary for the stability of the dynasty and, no less importantly, to strengthen their own influence. A behind-the-scenes struggle began for the right to present a new spouse to the emperor. Each of the 3 powerful freedmen, Pallas, Callistus, and Narcissus, had his own candidate. Callistus promoted Lollia Paulina, Caligula's ex-wife, a woman of noble birth and great wealth. Narcissus, the hero of Messalina's overthrow, backed Aelia Paetina, Claudius's own second wife, whom he had divorced many years earlier. This marriage would have meant the reunion of the old family. But the most cunning and influential of the freedmen, the financial manager Pallas, bet on Agrippina. His arguments presented to Claudius were irresistible. Agrippina, he told the emperor, was not just a noblewoman. She was the daughter of his beloved, adored brother Germanicus, the embodiment of his family's glory. Marriage to her would forever unite the 2 branches of the imperial house, the Julii and the Claudii. Moreover, she was a mature woman tested by misfortune, and unlike the young Messalina, not prone to recklessness. And most importantly, she had a son, Lucius Domitius, a direct descendant of Augustus. He could in time be betrothed to Claudius's daughter, Octavia, further strengthening the dynasty and securing the future. Pallas, as malicious tongues claimed, was already Agrippina's lover, and their union was not only political but also personal. Agrippina herself was not idle. As a niece, she had free access to the emperor, using all her feminine charm, playing on his sentimental feelings for the memory of his brother Germanicus. She gradually seduced her uncle Claudius. Tacitus caustically remarks that she abused her kinship, and soon these caresses took effect. Claudius was conquered. But there was one huge obstacle: Roman law and custom. Marriage between an uncle and a niece in Rome was considered incest and was strictly forbidden. To get around this prohibition, a whole political comedy was staged. An influential senator, Lucius Vitellius, who was the father of a future emperor, known for his flattery, delivered a fiery speech in the Senate. He argued that the emperor's marriage to Agrippina was a matter of state importance, necessary for stability. He urged the senators that they must compel the princeps to this step for the good of Rome. The Senate obediently passed a special decree permitting marriages between an uncle and his brother's daughter. The next day, a crowd, obviously organized by Agrippina's supporters, gathered at the Palatine Palace and began to loudly demand this union. Claudius, as if yielding to the will of the Senate and the people, graciously agreed. In the year 49, Agrippina the Younger, at the age of 34, became the fourth wife of the Emperor Claudius. From this moment, her triumph begins. She was not going to be just a wife consort like her predecessors. She sought real power, the status of a co-ruler, and she achieved it. As early as the year 50, the Senate granted her the honorary title of Augusta. Before her, only one living woman had held this title, the great Livia, wife of Augustus, and she had received it only in his will after his death. Agrippina became the first to be named Augusta during her husband Emperor's lifetime. This was not just a title. It was a symbol of her exceptional, almost equal position. Her images appeared on coins again, often next to Claudius's as his equal. She was present at all official ceremonies, received ambassadors, and participated in Senate meetings, hiding behind a curtain and listening to all the debates. She founded a colony of veterans at her birthplace, giving it her name, which was another unprecedented act. She wrote memoirs which unfortunately have not survived, but which were cited by later historians like Tacitus and Pliny the Elder. She had become an empress in the full sense of the word, but her main goal was not her own greatness. Everything she did was subordinated to one all-consuming passion: to secure the throne for her son Lucius. Claudius's own son, Britannicus, was still too young, and Agrippina began to methodically, step by step, clear the way for her offspring. The first step was adoption. In that same year 50, she convinced Claudius to adopt her son. Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus became Nero Claudius Caesar Drusus Germanicus. He formally became Britannicus's older brother. This was a decisive move. In the eyes of the Romans, an adopted son often had even more rights than a natural one. The second step was creating a team. She surrounded herself with loyal people. She secured the return from exile of the Stoic philosopher Lucius Annaeus Seneca and made him the young Nero's tutor. Seneca, one of the brilliant minds of his time, owed everything to Agrippina, and he served her cause faithfully. She appointed her own man, Sextus Afranius Burrus, a stern and honest soldier who was also entirely devoted to her, as commander of the Praetorian Guard. The alliance of Agrippina, Pallas, Seneca, and Burrus became the new center of power in the empire. The third step was the isolation and discrediting of Britannicus. Agrippina removed all of his loyal tutors and servants from the boy, replacing them with her own people. Any demonstration of sympathy for Britannicus was punished. The boy effectively grew up in a golden cage, pushed into the background by his older, more charismatic and increasingly popular stepbrother. Nero, on the contrary, was constantly in the spotlight. He gave speeches in the Senate, participated in triumphs, and in the year 53, he was married to Claudius's daughter Octavia. Agrippina was molding him into a future emperor. Her power was almost absolute. Claudius, aging and perhaps already suffering from senile dementia, was completely under her influence. But Agrippina knew that her position depended on one man's life. As long as Claudius was alive, she was safe. But what would happen after his death? Britannicus was growing up. In the year 54, he was due to turn 14, the age of majority in Rome. He could don the toga of an adult and claim his rights. And Narcissus, Agrippina's old enemy who still retained influence over Claudius, began to more actively support Britannicus. Agrippina felt that time was working against her. Rumors began to spread that Claudius was beginning to show signs of remorse for having sidelined his own son. Tacitus reports his words that he was doomed to endure the crimes of his wives and then to punish them. This was a direct hint at Agrippina. She understood that she had to act, and act quickly. The night of October 12th to 13th in the year 54. Silence reigned in the imperial palace on the Palatine, but the air was electrified. Emperor Claudius, who was already 63, had finished dinner and retired to his chambers. He was not feeling well, but for a man who had suffered from various ailments his whole life and was also famous for his immoderate appetite and love of wine, this was not something unusual. No outsider knew that this night would be his last. What exactly happened that night will forever remain a mystery, buried under the weight of time and contradictory testimonies. But all ancient historians such as Tacitus, Suetonius, and Dio Cassius are practically unanimous on one point. Claudius was poisoned, and behind this poisoning stood his wife, Agrippina. The scenario they paint is worthy of a Greek tragedy. Agrippina, seeing that Claudius was beginning to show clear favor to his natural son Britannicus and might change his will in his favor, decided to act preemptively. She had long kept a poison ready, prepared by a famous poisoner in Rome named Locusta, whom she kept by her side for such needs. The poison was mixed into the emperor's favorite dish, mushrooms. The taster who was supposed to try the emperor's food was the eunuch Helotus. Either he was in on the plot or he simply did not notice the poison, which may have been tasteless or disguised by the strong flavor of the mushrooms. Claudius ate the fatal dish. However, the poison, as Tacitus writes, did not act immediately or as strongly as expected. Perhaps its effect was weakened by the large amount of wine and food consumed. The emperor became ill. He began to vomit, and it seemed he might expel the poison and survive. Agrippina, watching the events, panicked. Everything was at stake. And then the emperor's personal physician, a Greek named Xenophon, who was also in league with the Empress, stepped in. Under the pretext of helping to induce vomiting, he inserted a feather into Claudius's throat, which, historians claim, had been previously coated with a potent poison. This time the poison acted instantly. The emperor died in agony. Immediately after her husband's death, Agrippina displayed icy composure and brilliant calculation. The emperor's death had to be concealed until all measures were taken for a smooth transfer of power to Nero. The palace was immediately cordoned off by praetorians loyal to Burrus. Agrippina pretended that Claudius was still alive, but very weak, and that the doctors were fighting for his life. She feigned grief, embraced Britannicus and his sisters, effectively holding them under arrest in one of the rooms, so they could not inform anyone of what had happened. She sent out messengers with news of the emperor's improving health to lull to sleep anyone who might obstruct her plans, primarily Narcissus, who, fortunately for Agrippina, was not in Rome at that moment. He too would soon be forced to commit suicide. All this time, frantic work was going on behind the scenes. Seneca and Burrus were preparing the army and the Senate for the change of power. They were waiting for a favorable moment predicted by astrologers in whom the Romans firmly believed. And so, at noon on October 13th, when the stars, according to the Chaldeans, were most favorably aligned, the gates of the Palatine Palace swung open. Before the Praetorians, already assembled and instructed by Burrus, emerged the 17-year-old Nero, accompanied by his prefect. Burrus gave a short speech, and the soldiers, who had been promised generous gifts of 15,000 sesterces each, as was customary upon a change of emperor, unanimously proclaimed Nero the new princeps. From there, Nero, accompanied by the guard, went to the Senate building. The senators, faced with a fait accompli and not daring to contradict the will of the Praetorians, meekly confirmed him in all imperial powers and titles. No one even mentioned Britannicus. Agrippina's triumph was complete. She had reached the pinnacle of her ambitions. Her son, her flesh and blood, her project, had become master of the world. She had done what no woman before her had managed. She had created an emperor. In the first months of Nero's reign, her power was absolute. She was not just the emperor's mother, she was his co-ruler, regent, and chief political player. Nero was young, inexperienced, and completely under her influence. Her power was demonstrated openly and defiantly. She received ambassadors, and her name was mentioned in reports to the Senate. Coins were even minted on which her profile was depicted on the main side, face to face with her sons, a symbol of complete equality and power. When an embassy from Armenia arrived in Rome, she was about to ascend the platform next to Nero and sit beside him to hear the ambassadors together. This was unheard of. No woman had ever allowed herself such a thing. Only at the last moment did the old and wise Seneca, understanding what a scandal this would cause, whisper to Nero to descend from the platform and meet his mother, as if paying her filial respect, but thereby preventing her from sitting next to him on the imperial throne. Agrippina immediately began to deal with her enemies. The first victim was Marcus Junius Silanus, proconsul of Asia, a great-great-grandson of Augustus, who also had dynastic claims to the throne. He was poisoned without trial. She eliminated Domitia Lepida, her old rival and Nero's aunt, accusing her of witchcraft. She was the mistress of Rome. It seemed nothing could shake her position. She had created a perfect system of power. Herself as the supreme strategist, her loyal executors Seneca and Burrus managing civil and military affairs, and the young, obedient Emperor Nero as the facade of this system. But she had overlooked one thing. Her greatest creation, her son, was growing up, and in his soul, under the influence of new friends and his own passions, the seeds of rebellion against her total control were already maturing. The snake she had warmed in her bosom was preparing to deliver a fatal bite. The first 5 years of Nero's reign went down in history as the Golden Quinquennium. Under the wise guidance of Seneca and Burrus, and under the unseen but all-pervading supervision of Agrippina, the empire was governed with surprising efficiency. The Senate had some of its old privileges restored, taxes were reduced, and justice was administered fairly. But behind this prosperous facade, a tense psychological drama was unfolding. The struggle for influence over the young emperor. And in this struggle, Agrippina began to rapidly lose ground. The problem lay in the very nature of her power and her character. She was a mother, accustomed to commanding and controlling her son's every step. She did not want to see him as an adult man and an independent ruler. She continued to treat him as an instrument for the realization of her own ambitions. Any attempt by Nero to show independence, any action not coordinated with her, provoked her angry reproaches and lectures. She constantly reminded him that for everything he had, from power to life itself, he owed solely to her. And this humiliating reminder began to increasingly irritate the young emperor who craved freedom. Her main rivals in the struggle for Nero's soul were his tutors, Seneca and Burrus. At first, they were her loyal allies, but they soon realized that Agrippina's boundless ambitions and imperiousness posed a threat not only to their own position, but also to the stability of the state. They began to act more subtly and cunningly. They did not engage in open conflict with her, but encouraged Nero's desire for independence. They indulged his passions, which Agrippina, as a stern Roman matron, despised. His love for poetry, music, theater, and horse racing. They seemed to be saying to him that they understood him, that they were on his side while his mother was the past, strict supervision, and boring state affairs. But the real catalyst for the break was a woman. Nero fell in love. His chosen one was a freedwoman, a former slave from Asia Minor named Claudia Acte. She was beautiful, graceful, and, unlike his domineering mother and his cold and virtuous wife Octavia, who had been forced upon him, she offered him tenderness, admiration, and unconditional adoration. Nero was genuinely infatuated. He even talked of marrying her. For Agrippina, this was unheard of. The emperor, a descendant of the divine Augustus and some former slave. She threw a grand tantrum at her son. She screamed that if he married Acte, she would do everything to overthrow him. And in her rage, she made a fatal mistake. She threatened that she had a legitimate heir, Britannicus, the son of the divine Claudius, who was about to come of age and whom the army would be glad to see on the throne. By threatening Nero with Britannicus, she signed the boy's death warrant. Nero, frightened that his mother might actually use his stepbrother for a coup, decided to get rid of his rival. In February of the year 55, during a feast in front of the entire court, the 14-year-old Britannicus suddenly fell ill and died in terrible convulsions. The official cause was declared to be epilepsy, from which he had supposedly suffered since childhood. But everyone present, including Agrippina, understood that it was poison administered by order of the emperor. Agrippina was horrified and desperate. She watched the last descendant of Claudius, her last potential support and tool of blackmail, die and could do nothing. She realized that her son was capable of anything. After the murder of Britannicus, the break between mother and son became irreversible. Nero began to methodically strip her of power and subject her to humiliations. He removed her main ally, Pallas, from the management of finances. He deprived her of her honorary personal guard of German mercenaries. He forced her to leave the imperial palace on the Palatine and move into the house where her great-grandmother Antonia had once lived. When she came to the Palatine, she was subjected to humiliating searches. He hired people to heckle her in public and to harass her with lawsuits. Agrippina tried to resist. She sought support from old friends, from army officers, reminding them of her father, the great Germanicus. But all her attempts were in vain. Power was slipping from her hands like sand through her fingers. Her entire creation, her perfectly constructed system, was collapsing. The final nail in the coffin of her influence was the appearance of a new woman in Nero's life. This was Poppaea Sabina, one of the most beautiful, intelligent, and ambitious women in Rome. She was married to Nero's friend Otho, a future short-lived emperor, but her goal was Nero himself and the imperial throne. She became the emperor's mistress and began to systematically turn him against his mother. She mocked him, calling him a mama's boy who did not dare to get rid of his strict overseer. She whispered to him that as long as Agrippina was alive, he would never be a real emperor and would not be able to divorce the hated Octavia to marry her, Poppaea. Nero, torn between the remnants of filial affection, an irrational fear of his mother, and an all-consuming passion for Poppaea, was slowly approaching a terrible decision. He began to believe that his mother was plotting against him, that she wanted to kill him. He began to see her not just as a rival, but as a mortal threat. Seneca and Burrus, seeing this tragedy unfold, tried to smooth over the conflict, but their influence was also waning. The emperor increasingly listened to Poppaea and to new, more unscrupulous advisors like the Praetorian prefect Tigellinus. The disintegration of Agrippina's masterpiece was almost complete. Only the final, bloodiest act remained. By the beginning of the year 59, Nero was finally convinced that he had to get rid of his mother. But how to do it? To simply execute her on charges of conspiracy was dangerous. Agrippina, despite the loss of real power, was still the daughter of Germanicus, and her direct murder could cause outrage in the army and among the common people, where the memory of her father was sacred. It had to be staged as an accident, and Nero, with his love for theatrical effects and grand productions, devised a truly diabolical plan. He invited his mother to the festival of the Quinquatria, dedicated to the goddess Minerva, at his villa in Baiae, on the Bay of Naples. He staged a whole performance of reconciliation. He was unusually gracious, meeting her at the pier, embracing her, seating her at the banquet table in the most honorable place. Agrippina, tired of years of enmity, perhaps wanted to believe in this reconciliation. After the feast, which lasted late into the night, he personally escorted her to the pier. A special, richly decorated ship was prepared for her return to her own villa at Baiae. This was the murder weapon. The vessel had been designed by his freedman Anicetus, Nero's former tutor and now prefect of the Messinum fleet. On a signal, a heavy lead canopy above the cabin where Agrippina was to rest was supposed to collapse and crush her. And the ship itself, with weakened fastenings, was supposed to fall apart and sink. Agrippina set sail. With her on the ship were her faithful maid, Acheronia Polla, and the freedman Creperius Gallus. In the open sea, in the silence and under the stars, the mechanism was activated. The lead roof collapsed with a crash. Creperius Gallus was crushed to death. But Agrippina was saved by chance. The high and strong back of her couch withstood the blow. The ship began to fall apart, but not as quickly as planned. In the ensuing confusion and darkness, Acheronia made a fatal mistake. Thinking it would help her to be saved, she cried out that she was Agrippina and asked to be served, the mother of the emperor. The rowers, who were in league with Anicetus, immediately fell upon her and beat her to death with boat hooks and oars, thinking they were killing the empress. Agrippina herself, in silence, with a shoulder wound, threw herself into the water. Despite her age and pampered lifestyle, she proved to be a good swimmer. She swam to some fishing boats which picked her up and took her to her villa on the Lucrine lake. Now she understood everything. Her son's treachery, the feigned feast, the collapsing ship. All the pieces of the puzzle fell into place in a single monstrous picture. But she did not lose her composure. She decided to pretend she had understood nothing. She sent her freedman Agrippinus to Nero with a message that, thanks to the favor of the gods and the emperor's good fortune, she had been saved after a terrible accident. But she asked him not to worry and not to come, as she needed rest. She was still trying to buy time, to outplay him, to make him fear the consequences. But Nero, upon receiving the news that his mother was alive, was terrified. He was sure that now she, knowing everything, would unleash all her fury on him, raise the army, appeal to the Senate. In a panic, he summoned Seneca and Burrus. They, as Tacitus writes, were silent for a long time, understanding that they were being drawn into a monstrous crinty. Finally, Seneca asked Burrus if the Praetorians could be ordered to kill Agrippina. Burrus replied that the Praetorians, loyal to the memory of Germanicus, would never raise a hand against his daughter, and then he suggested that the one who had started the job should finish it. The freedman Anicetus and his sailors, who were not bound by such ties of loyalty. Anicetus gladly agreed. He surrounded Agrippina's villa. The messenger Agrippinus, who had arrived from her, was seized. A dagger was planted on him, and it was announced that he had been sent by the mother to kill the emperor. This created a pretext for further action. Anicetus, with a detachment of sailors, burst into Agrippina's bedroom. The room was lit by only one dim lamp. Beside her remained only one maid, who at the last moment also fled, leaving her mistress alone. Agrippina, rising on her couch, met the murderers and told them that if they had come to visit her, she was already feeling better. But if for a crime, she did not believe it was her son's order, for he would not order matricide. But the murderers silently surrounded her. One of them, a trierarch, struck her on the head with a club, and then, seeing the centurion's sword raised above her, she tore off her clothes and, pointing to her womb, uttered her last immortal phrase, that it was this womb that should be struck. She was stabbed with numerous blows. Nero, as rumors have it, came to see the naked body of his dead mother. He examined her wounds according to some accounts, praising the beauty of her body, according to others, criticizing it. Then he asked for wine to celebrate what had been done. Her body was burned that same night on a simple dining couch by her own servants. Thus ended the life of one of the most outstanding and terrible women in the history of Rome. A woman who had achieved everything and lost everything because of the one person for whom she had lived and fought. The murder of his mother became a point of no return for Nero. It broke him. Tacitus writes that from this moment, he began to rapidly slide into the abyss of madness. He was tormented by nightmares. The ghost of his mother appeared to him, and he was pursued by furies with burning torches. Trying to justify himself before the world and himself, he sent a letter to the Senate, composed by Seneca, in which he accused Agrippina of conspiracy and claimed that she had committed suicide when her plot was discovered. The Senate hypocritically congratulated him on his salvation and decreed thanksgiving services. But the common people of Rome were not deceived. Graffiti and anonymous verses appeared on the walls, cursing the matricide. Freed from his mother's supervision, Nero gave free rein to all his suppressed passions. He divorced Octavia, exiled her, and later had her killed to marry Poppaea. He began to perform publicly on stage as a singer, poet, and actor, which was considered an unheard-of disgrace for a Roman aristocrat, let alone an emperor. His reign turned into a series of executions, confiscations, and insane expenditures. The Great Fire of Rome in the year 64, for which popular rumor blamed the emperor himself, became the apogee of his reign. It all ended in the year 68, when the legions in the provinces rebelled against him. Abandoned by all, declared an enemy of the state, Nero committed suicide, reportedly uttering the words, "What an artist dies in me." With his death, the Julio-Claudian dynasty was extinguished. The great house that Augustus and Agrippa had built, and which Agrippina the Younger had so desperately and bloodily tried to preserve, perished in blood and shame. Her grand plan, the work of her life, had ended in complete failure. What, then, is Agrippina's legacy? For ancient historians writing from a senatorial, conservative perspective such as Tacitus, Suetonius, and Dio Cassius, she was the embodiment of evil. They paint her image in exclusively dark colors, as a power-hungry, immoral, treacherous intriguer and poisoner, guilty of incest. For them, a woman actively involved in high politics was a nonsense, a violation of all foundations and divine laws. They saw in her the main reason for the moral decay of the imperial court and the subsequent tyranny of Nero. Modern historians view her more complexly and objectively. They recognize her outstanding abilities. She was, without a doubt, one of the most intelligent and politically gifted women of her era. She possessed an iron will, strategic thinking, and incredible determination. In a world where a woman's role was exclusively private, that of a wife and mother, she managed to become the de facto ruler of the vast Roman Empire. She set a precedent showing that a woman could hold real political power. In this sense, she was a forerunner of the great empresses of the future. such as Julia Domna or the Byzantine Theodora. But the methods she used were ruthless. She walked over heads to reach her goal, shrinking from nothing, not seduction, not betrayal, and, very likely, not murder. Her tragedy was that she became a hostage of the very system she tried to control. A system based on the absolute power of one person, where court intrigues, conspiracies, and assassinations were the norm of political life. Her biggest mistake was in her greatest love, her son. She was so determined to give him absolute power that she failed to teach him the most important thing, how to use that power. She saw him not as a person but as her project, her extension, her instrument. And when this project got out of control, it destroyed its creator. The story of Agrippina is the eternal story of how absolute power corrupts absolutely, of how the best intentions, especially in politics, can lead to monstrous consequences. It is the tragedy of a mother who gave birth to a monster, and of a brilliant politician whose greatest creation became the cause of her death, and the collapse of everything she had fought for. Her name will forever remain in history as a formidable symbol of boundless ambition and the terrible, bloody price that sometimes must be paid for power. Thank you for your attention. If this story seemed interesting to you, and you wish to continue delving into the most captivating and dramatic pages of the past, please subscribe to our channel, leave your comments, and share this video. Many more amazing journeys through time await us.